Right. Welcome to day 2 of our first week. And after the chemistry review that you all did yesterday, it is time to get into the second part of chapter 2, which is something that we're going to spend a little bit of extra time in, because this may not be some stuff that you are super familiar with, but we need to have an understanding of these macromolecules. Okay, so this is part of 2.3 in your textbook. All right, but the second part of what I consider chapter 2. So organic macromolecules. For a molecule to be considered organic, it has to have both C and H. I will ask you this question over and over and over again. If you can't tell me, by next week what elements all organic molecules have, then you're in trouble. Okay, so if they all have C and H, they are very large, macromolecules, and they are typically a lot larger than inorganic molecules. So inorganic molecules do not contain both carbon and hydrogen, so they're easy to know what they are. Okay, so some important ones that we will get into this year are water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. So notice, okay, we have hydrogen here but no carbon. We have carbon here but no hydrogen. Okay, so these are still considered inorganic. Even though they have one, they don't have both. Certain salts like calcium phosphate, super important. They make sure that your bones are rigid. And that brings us to our macromolecules. So we have carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We are going to review carbohydrates and lipids today. All right. So common characteristics of our macromolecules. They are built from smaller parts. Okay, there are simple structures that will combine, they'll bond together, and they'll form these larger macromolecules. So these simple structures are called monomer units. So think of them like, how cells are to your body. Okay, these monomer units are the building blocks of the macromolecule. Right? A polymer is going to be many of these monomer units bonded together. Okay, so our examples for a carbohydrate, glucose would be the monomer, glycogen would be many glucose bonded together. Lipids, we have triglycerides or fats. These fats are composed of a glycerol and 3 fatty acid tails. Proteins are made up of many amino acids, and nucleic acids, example here would be DNA, which are many, many, many nucleotides. Okay, so the nucleotides, the amino acids, the fatty acids and glycerol, the glucose, those are all monomers to the polymers in glycogen, triglycerides, a protein, and DNA. All right, so we're going to start off with carbohydrates. So the structure of carbohydrates, they contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, typically at a ratio of about 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. Now, they don't all contain exactly this amount, but very close to this amount. They are polar, so they are water soluble. All this means is that they have charged, or partially charged ends. A monomer is going to be 1 ring. So it could be glucose, it could be fructose. Those are just a couple of examples. Monomers of carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. Dimers contain 2 rings, so 2 monosaccharides bonded together. Those are called disaccharides. And a polymer is going to contain at least 10 of these monosaccharides bonded together. Okay, and something like glycogen contains many more than just 10. Okay, so here are some examples. So we have our monosaccharides here, glucose, fructose, and galactose. as well as deoxyribose and ribose. In disaccharides, we have sucrose, lactose, and maltose. So sucrose, you might notice from a lot of the food that you may eat, contains glucose and fructose. Lactose contains galactose and glucose, and maltose contains glucose and glucose. Polysaccharides, glycogen, that's important for us. That's how we store our glucose. Cellulose and starch, those would be things that we eat, okay, plants. So cellulose is contained in the cell walls of plants. We cannot digest them. Starches, though, we can digest, and that's how we get, most of our energy. All right, so some types of monosaccharides, like I said, we have glucose. That is the main unit of energy that we use in our body. Fructose is sweeter than glucose, and we find that in our food. So, if you think of high fructose corn syrup, it's going to, in a lot of pops and stuff like that, makes it super sweet. Galactose is part of milk sugars, part of lactose. And then we also have ribose and deoxyribose. So, think about where do we find deoxyribose and ribose? All right, next we have our polysaccharides. So we've got glycogen, which we store in our livers, cellulose, which are contained in rigid cell walls. We as humans cannot digest them. Our digestive system is not equipped to do so. So that, cellulose is essentially fiber to us. Okay, starch, that is the plant's energy store. These are polysaccharides that we can digest, so we can break down and use the glucose that makes it up. And then chitin, this is the only time you're going to hear about chitin this year. They're made up of, certain fungal cell walls as well as the exoskeletons of some animals. Okay, so the functions of carbohydrates, they help to provide us with quick energy. They can be stored as a long-term energy supply. So glucose we can break down, as well as some of those other monosaccharides that we can convert into glucose. Glycogen is the long-term storage of the glucose. And they can also provide raw material for building cell structures, such as carbohydrates that are used to identify cells. And that brings us to lipids. So lipids are kind of varied, but they are for the most part non-polar. So that means that they are insoluble in water. They are uncharged. They contain mostly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, with the exception of our phospholipid, which contain phosphorus as well. They have less oxygen than in carbohydrates, but phospholipids can contain phosphate, but phosphorus as our element. All right, so the first one we're going to look at are triglycerides, and this is our triglyceride here. So glycerol with 3 fatty acid tails. They are used as energy. They are stored as long-term energy that we can use whenever we deplete our carbohydrates. A little bit about the structure of fatty acids, those tails that we have here. They can be either saturated or unsaturated. So saturated means that all of these carbons are bonded together with single bonds, and they have the maximum number of hydrogens here filling it up. So unsaturated is different in that they have at least one double bond, which means that, first of all, it's going to make the acid tail nonlinear, and there are less hydrogens than there would be up here when it is saturated. Okay, so saturated fats, these are typically the ones that you want less of, and they are found in animal products like meat and dairy, as well as coconut and palm oils. Unsaturated fats are typically the ones that are more healthy for you, and they are found in plant fats like in oils, nuts, and seeds. Okay, so the glycerol, just a nice zoomed in picture that we got here. It's 3 carbons filled up with hydrogens, as well as these OH groups down here. Okay, and this is where the fatty acid tails are going to bond. Next, we got phospholipids. So again, just like a fat, we have glycerol and two fatty acids, but instead of the third, we have a phosphate. So these are the primary structure of our cell and organelle membranes. Okay, remember the double layer of phospholipids. That is, these are the basic structures that make up our membranes. So the phosphate is polar, whereas these fatty acids are nonpolar, so that makes the molecule have both a water soluble, so the phosphate, and a water insoluble tail here. So they have two regions, which is why it forms a double layer. All right, and finally, you have steroids, and steroids contain 4 connected carbon rings like this. Okay, this is different from a carbohydrate in that these rings share at least 2 carbons. Okay, so they're connected a little bit more intimately, I guess you could say, than carbohydrates would be. All right, so this is the basic structure of a steroid, and steroids can have different, different units that are bonded to different carbons that make up the rings. Okay, so our example that we have here is cholesterol, which is a steroid. Okay, so again, these are nonpolar. They provide stability in the cell membrane, but they can also be used as hormones for communication between cells. Okay, and that is all that we are doing for today. So at this point, you should have a little bit more knowledge of carbohydrates and lipids. So check out the Google form and answer it to the best of your ability.